Hey, Mike.
Hey, Tim.
So the topic is change and change management, and we've got a picture over there called the change curve. And want to get it kicked off with a story, but just quickly, how do you react to change?
So I thought about this, and what I'm aware in myself is I do get quite established in the way things work and the way I like things working. So my initial reaction to change can be quite negative. It can be quite rejecting, and as you can see, there's shock and a bit of anger and stuff. But so that is quite exaggerated almost, that initial reaction. However, I can then see that I can move very quickly through and just accept it and be like, okay, let's make the most of it. So it's kind of like an exaggerated reaction, and then, oh, what were you worried about? Let's get on with it, kind of thing. So I think that's where I am. What about you, Tim?
I noticed that when I write a proposal and I put 3, 4 hours or 2 days into a proposal, and I put everything in, I put my heart blood into it, then I get really huffy and really annoyed when the customer throws it back and says, we want something different. We want it to be changed. I said, change? This is the best. How can you not see how cool this is? And now I have to go back and change it. And I have, I work with a few product managers, and they say that, they put together work with the expectation of it being thrown back and wanting it. And so they put in huge amounts of time into concepts and ideas with the expectation that it will be changed. And I noticed that they have a way more mature way of dealing with change than I do. Yeah, so it's very personal. I have an interesting story. There is a story about a post office organization which was privatized about 15, 20 years ago, and it was bought by a capitalistic or a capitalist organization. It was an American company that bought a European company. So a capitalist organization bought a quasi-socialist organization, entrepreneurial organization bought a state-owned, so very much, socialist kind of organization. Small company bought a big company, and it was culturally an extremely interesting deal, and a huge amount of change was unleashed. What was interesting was that within this country, there was a term which was called having tenure. Do you know what that means? When you have tenure?
I think it's used in the US educational system for when a professor if they've been established for a certain length of time, they get tenure, and it kind of means they can't be fired. It means they're just almost guaranteed their place. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we mean. It's a situation where there were a lot of people who couldn't be fired. So their contract status was one that said, you can't fire me. Yeah. But it's not the same as having tenure, because tenure is a university thing. So think the same kind of principle in state-run organizations, in post offices and hospitals and teachers. In a lot of European countries, they still have this format of contract, or it's dying out now, but it still exists. And so this American company bought, I think it was something crazy, like, over 15,000 contracts for people who had tenure, who couldn't be fired. And so we were working with leaders, and the leaders would be responsible for 30 people. We're saying, 30 people? Are you crazy? Normal size of a team is 8, maybe 12, maybe 14, 15, depending on what they do. But 30 is just crazy. And they said, well, 15 of these people, we can't do anything with them because, well, they have tenure. They sit at home. They don't do anything. Can't motivate them. Can't get them to do anything. And so that was a very interesting deal for these leaders, and very, very frustrating for them. And eventually the organization, I think they hired a bunch of psychologists, and the psychologists went around the country knocking on doors and saying, look, the company has given us the possibility to have a conversation about where you want to go and what you want to do. In essence, what these psychologists were doing was that they were putting this change curve on the table, not physically. They were having a conversation around it. And they were saying, look, you're over there on the left, and you've been over there on the left for 5 years. How long is it going to take? Is that it? And that was the mechanism of confronting people with where they are in their change process and bringing them forward quicker. And I think in terms of, when we go into the description of the model, that's possibly the greatest thing that leaders can do, is help people move forward faster. Guess how old there was an average age of these people. Guess what was the average age?
Well, if we're talking about tenured people, then I'm going to guess somewhere in kind of, let me say late 40s, 48.
Yeah, so the average age was like 41, 42. There were people who hadn't worked for 5 years who were 25 years old. They're sitting at home doing nothing. Yeah. What's going on? Why don't you want to go to work? Get paid, don't have to go to work. Why should I?
I think it brings up a really interesting question when it comes to the change curve, which is how do you, or even can you, bring somebody through this process that doesn't want to or is resisting change? How do you really get them to actually move through? I mean, I see resistance is actually 4th stage out of the 9 on that, but at some point that I could see that might be the hardest one for a leader to push past.
And it's worth saying that this model was based on the work of a lady called Kubler-Ross. She was a physician and a doctor, and she was using it in a completely different context. I think she would be turning in her grave if she knew that, one of the most important things that her model does is to help large organizations go through change processes in their companies. But that's the reality of it. She used it to address the topic of grief and when people were grieving. And that's what happens when people go through that grief process. And sure, how do you help somebody deal with their shock, deal with resistance in that context?
Mm. Yeah, I was reading about that. So her book came out in 1969, I think. And as you said, it was a 5-stage process, which I believe was denial, anger. What was the third one, Tim?
I think it was, I hope it was resistance.
Resistance,
there
depression,
was
acceptance.
Yeah. And you see it in a lot of different formats. You see a negotiation stage, an active resistance, a passive resistance. A lot of different words have come in, but absolutely, originally, this acceptance stage was quite difficult to get to.
Mm-hmm.